The phone call came at 11:47 p.m. on a Thursday night, shattering the fragile peace that had finally managed to find after months of sleepless worry. She was just drifting off to sleep when her cell phone's piercing ring cut through the darkness of her bedroom. Her heart immediately seized with a premonition of disaster. At 63 years old, with a lifetime of experience behind her, had learned to trust her instincts. They had never failed her before, and they weren't failing her now. On the other end of the line was a woman named Social Services Representative Sarah, her voice carrying the careful, measured tone that officials use when delivering devastating news. Sarah's words came in a structured sequence, each one heavier than the last. There had been a welfare check on an apartment in the northeast part of the city. A concerned neighbor had reported hearing a child crying continuously for hours, combined with evidence of severe neglect and potential drug activity. When officers arrived at the scene, they found 3-year-old Emma's granddaughter, alone in a filthy apartment, crying hysterically, dehydrated and showing signs of malnutrition. The apartment itself was a disaster. Scattered drug paraphernalia, overflowing garbage, no food in the refrigerator except for expired condiments, and a bedroom where a small child clearly slept on a bare mattress. Emma's mother, Jessica, only daughter, was not at the apartment. She had apparently been gone for an undetermined amount of time, possibly 8 hours, possibly longer. Neighbors couldn't say for certain. All they knew was that a baby was left alone, crying, hungry, and completely unsupervised. The police had already taken Emma to Children's Medical Center, where she was being examined for signs of abuse or illness. Sarah wanted to know that Emma was safe now, but she needed to come to the hospital immediately. The situation was serious, very serious. His hands went numb as she hung up the phone. For a moment she couldn't move, couldn't think, couldn't breathe properly. She sank onto the edge of her bed, staring at nothing, her mind struggling to process the words that had just torn her world apart. Emma, her precious granddaughter, alone, crying, hungry. The images her mind conjured were unbearable, each one worse than the last. How long had Emma been alone? What had she endured? Was she hurt, sick, traumatized beyond repair? Had known for months that Jessica was spiraling. A mother recognizes these things in her children, even when they're adults with their own lives. She had watched helplessly as her daughter's addiction to methamphetamine had transformed her from a vibrant, loving young mother into a shadow of herself. What had started as recreational use had quickly escalated into a consuming obsession. Jessica had lost her job. She'd lost her apartment and moved into increasingly squalid living situations. She'd lost custody of Emma temporarily 6 months ago, and Emma had been living with while the courts worked through the rehabilitation requirements and custody evaluations. But then Jessica had completed a 60-day rehab program. She'd seemed genuinely committed to recovery. She'd attended her court-ordered therapy sessions and passed her drug tests for 3 months straight. The judge had been cautiously optimistic and against better judgment, a judgment she now bitterly regretted ignoring. The courts had returned Emma to Jessica's care with supervised visitation requirements. Was supposed to have visits every Sunday. Just 6 weeks ago, Emma had come to stay with her grandmother for an overnight visit, and she'd been happy, healthy, and adjusted. Threw on her clothes with shaking hands. It was just before midnight, but she didn't care. She grabbed her purse and keys, not bothering with anything else. Her car keys rattled in her trembling fingers as she locked her front door and practically ran to her 15-year-old Civic. The drive to Children's Medical Center had never seemed longer. Every red light felt like a cruel joke. Every slow driver felt like an obstacle placed deliberately in her path. Her mind raced with 1,000 terrible possibilities, each one more horrifying than the last. When she finally arrived at the emergency room at 12:34 a.m., a social worker named found her in the waiting area. He had kind eyes, but they carried the weight of having seen too much suffering. He led to a private consultation room and explained everything in clinical detail. Emma was suffering from severe dehydration and malnutrition. Her vital signs were concerning. Her heart rate was elevated, her temperature was slightly low, and her blood pressure was abnormally low for a child her age. The medical team suspected she had been alone without food or water for at least 8 to 10 hours. She had some minor bruising on her arms and legs, consistent with rough handling or possibly falls. Most concerning was her psychological state. Emma was not speaking. She wasn't making eye contact. She was trembling constantly and had flinched away from every human touch during the initial examination. Then finally led to the pediatric observation room. Emma lay in a hospital crib that seemed impossibly large for her tiny frame. She was wearing a hospital gown that dwarfed her small body. Various monitors and IVs were attached to her arms. Her hair was matted and dirty. Her skin was pale and papery thin. But her eyes, those big brown eyes that had always been so bright and full of curiosity, were now hollow and haunted. They were the eyes of someone who had seen things no 3-year-old should ever see, experienced trauma that her developing mind couldn't possibly process. Emma didn't recognize her grandmother at first. When approached the crib slowly, speaking in soft, gentle tones, Emma's body went rigid. She pressed herself into the corner of the crib, her eyes wide with fear. Her heart shattered into a million fragments. This was her granddaughter, a child she'd cared for since birth, a child who used to squeal with delight whenever she saw her grandmother's car pull into the driveway. Now Emma looked at her like she was a stranger. Worse, she looked at her like she was a threat. The nurse explained that Emma's reaction was typical of severely traumatized children. She would need time, patience, and professional help to process her experiences and relearn how to trust. Her attachment system had been disrupted. She'd learned that caregivers couldn't be relied upon to meet her basic needs. Every adult was potentially dangerous. Every situation was potentially a threat. The damage that had been inflicted in a single night, or possibly longer, might take months or years to heal. Stood there watching her granddaughter tremble in fear, and something shifted inside her. The pain, the anger, the regret, all of it crystallized into a single, unshakable resolve. She was going to fight for Emma. She was going to fight with every ounce of strength she possessed, with every resource she could muster, with every fiber of her being. No matter what it cost her, no matter how difficult the legal battle would be, no matter how much pain she would have to endure, she was going to bring Emma home permanently. She was going to heal her granddaughter's broken heart. She was going to give Emma back her childhood, her sense of safety, her ability to trust and love again. Pulled up a chair next to the crib and sat down, not trying to touch Emma, not trying to force connection. She simply sat there, maintaining a gentle presence, speaking in soft, soothing tones about memories and better times. Slowly, very slowly, Emma's breathing began to calm. The trembling decreased, and somewhere deep in that traumatized 3-year-old's heart, some ancient part of her recognized her grandmother's voice. By the time the sun rose over the city the next morning, Emma was sleeping peacefully for the first time since her rescue, and had made a vow that would define the next chapter of both their lives. Judge Richard sat in his chambers on a cold October morning, coffee growing cold in his ceramic mug, as he stared at the case file spread across his mahogany desk. His reading glasses sat perched on the bridge of his nose, and his face bore the weathered expression of a man who had spent 32 years witnessing the worst and best of human nature through the lens of family law. The file before him was labeled Versus Custody Modification Petition. But to Judge, it represented something far more significant: the complete failure of the system to protect the most vulnerable among them. Emma's case had landed on his docket just 2 weeks after her rescue from that filthy apartment. It was his 17th custody case that year alone, and it was only October. The sheer volume of family trauma flowing through the Tennessee judicial system was overwhelming. But this case was different. This case kept him awake at night, gnawing at his conscience, challenging every legal principle he'd held dear for 3 decades. Judge had presided over the initial emergency hearing, or had petitioned for emergency custody. The evidence presented had been damning. Medical reports documented Emma's severe malnutrition and dehydration. Photographs of the apartment where Emma had been found showed conditions that violated multiple health and safety codes. Police reports indicated the presence of drug paraphernalia consistent with methamphetamine production. Witness statements from neighbors corroborated a pattern of neglect and Jessica's increasing instability. The judge had granted temporary custody without hesitation, viewing it as a straightforward case of child endangerment requiring immediate intervention. But temporary custody was not permanent custody. That would require a full hearing, complete with testimony, evidence presentation, and most importantly, consideration of Jessica's rights as a biological parent. And that's where the case became impossibly complicated. Jessica had shown up to that initial hearing looking disheveled and confused, barely comprehending the proceedings. She'd hired a public defender named Michael, a competent lawyer who understood that his job wasn't to prove Jessica was a perfect mother. His job was to argue that she deserved a chance at redemption. Michael had presented a narrative of addiction as disease rather than moral failing. He'd submitted evidence that Jessica had been attending Narcotics Anonymous meetings. He'd produced documentation of her enrollment in a residential rehabilitation program. He'd argued that the single terrible night, or however long Emma had been left alone, was an isolated incident born of Jessica's disease, not evidence of permanent unfitness as a parent. And here was the crux of Judge's dilemma. Michael wasn't entirely wrong. The judge had spent 32 years studying family law and human psychology. He understood addiction intimately. He'd seen hundreds of people struggle with substance abuse, watched countless families torn apart, witnessed both genuine recoveries and tragic relapses. He also knew that the law presumed parents had fundamental rights to their children, rights that could only be stripped away under the most serious circumstances. Temporary neglect, even serious neglect, was not necessarily permanent proof of unfitness. What if Jessica genuinely recovered? What if she went through rehabilitation, stayed clean, and became the mother Emma needed? Would depriving her of that opportunity be justice, or would it be cruelty? Yet another part of Judge's mind, the part that had seen too much suffering, that had heard too many children's heartbreaking testimony about the parents who hurt them, screamed that Jessica didn't deserve another chance. Not when a child's life hung in the balance. Not when Emma's psychological wounds were so deep that the therapists warned recovery could take years. Not when Jessica had already been given one chance and had squandered it so catastrophically. The judge removed his glasses and rubbed his eyes, a gesture that had become increasingly common over the past 2 weeks. His secretary had commented that he looked exhausted. His wife, Susan, had suggested he take a vacation. His adult children had noticed him staring into space during family phone calls. He wasn't sleeping well. He was drinking too much coffee. And the case was only partially responsible. The weight of all 17 custody cases that year was crushing him under the accumulated burden of broken families and desperate choices. Earlier that morning, Judge had received a call from his attorney, a woman named Helen Martinez who had been practicing family law for 20 years. Helen was requesting a preliminary conference to discuss strategy before the full custody hearing. During their conversation, she had mentioned that was considering requesting psychological evaluation of Emma and psychological evaluation of Jessica. She was also requesting that Emma undergo forensic psychological evaluation, a process that would be traumatic for the child, but might provide concrete evidence of Jessica's role in causing psychological harm. Judge had listened carefully, taking notes, trying to maintain his judicial impartiality, but internally he was struggling. Helen had also mentioned that Emma was having nightmares. She was refusing to eat properly. She was having difficulty separating from even for short periods. These were classic signs of attachment trauma and complex PTSD. Could a 3-year-old even be diagnosed with PTSD? Could the courts hold Jessica accountable for psychological damage that might not even be fully diagnosable for years? The judge stood up from his desk and walked to the window of his chambers, looking out over the courthouse lawn where golden autumn leaves were falling in the afternoon breeze. He could see people hurrying across the grounds, some heading to hearings, some heading to trials, some heading to mediations, all of them carrying stories of conflict, pain, and desperation, all of them hoping that the legal system would somehow make things right, would somehow find a solution that would allow them to move forward and heal. But that's the thing about family law, Judge reflected. There was no solution that made everyone happy. There was no outcome where everyone healed. In custody cases, there were only choices between different kinds of pain. You could choose to protect the child from further abuse but deny them a biological parent. You could choose to honor parental rights but expose a vulnerable child to continued trauma. You could choose compassion for an addicted parent but risk the child's entire future. You could choose to be harsh and punitive, but that accomplished nothing except adding more suffering to an already broken family. Jessica was scheduled to appear for a court-ordered psychological evaluation next week. Had already completed her evaluation, which had come back glowing. No red flags, strong attachment to Emma, financially stable, appropriate parenting skills, and a genuine commitment to Emma's. The comparison would be stark, but Jessica's evaluation might show that she was responding to treatment, that her psychological baseline was stronger than initially feared, that rehabilitation was genuinely possible. Or it might confirm that her addiction issues were deeper than anyone had realized, that she posed an ongoing threat to Emma's safety. Judge returned to his desk and pulled out a legal pad. He began outlining the questions he needed answered before he could make a decision. What was the threshold for permanent loss of parental rights? How much weight should be given to Emma's psychological trauma versus Jessica's potential for recovery? What role should biological parenthood play versus demonstrated safety? Were there creative solutions, extended supervision, treatment requirements, graduated reintegration, that could satisfy both child protection and parental rights? He looked at the clock. It was already 6 p.m. His staff had left for the day. The courthouse was quiet except for the occasional footstep in the hallway. Judge knew he would be here for several more hours, wrestling with the impossible mathematics of justice, trying to find a path through the moral and legal labyrinth that Emma's case had become. This case, he realized, would define not just Emma's future, but perhaps his own legacy as a judge. And he had absolutely no idea which decision would be the right one. Officer had been with the Nashville Police Department for 19 years, and in that time, he'd learned that the most meaningful work he did had nothing to do with arrests or citations. It had everything to do with K-9 Officer Duke, a magnificent golden-furred German shepherd who had become not just his work partner, but his closest companion and truest friend. And Duke had been paired together 7 years ago, and in those 7 years, they had developed a bond that transcended the typical handler-dog relationship. They moved together like two halves of a single consciousness, reading each other's moods and intentions with an almost telepathic accuracy. Duke was no ordinary police dog. While he was trained in basic narcotics detection and search and rescue operations, his true calling had emerged almost accidentally during his volunteer work at a domestic violence shelter 3 years earlier. A woman fleeing an abusive husband had brought her traumatized daughter to the shelter. The child was terrified, withdrawn, and completely non-responsive to conventional therapeutic intervention. In a moment of inspiration, or perhaps desperation, had brought Duke to visit the shelter during his off hours. Within minutes of seeing Duke, the child had stopped crying. Within an hour, she was touching the dog's fur and speaking her first words in weeks. That single encounter had changed the trajectory of both and Duke's careers, had pursued additional certifications in animal-assisted therapy and trauma intervention. Duke had advanced training in reading human emotional states and responding with appropriate comfort measures. Together, they had become a certified therapeutic team, deployed to domestic violence situations, child abuse cases, hospital trauma wards, and emergency response situations, where human minds had been shattered by incomprehensible violence. It was in this capacity that received a call from Judge Richard's office on a Tuesday afternoon in early November. The judge's secretary explained that His Honor would like to speak with officer about a sensitive matter related to an ongoing custody case. Was intrigued but hesitant. His therapeutic work with Duke was typically coordinated through official social services channels, not through the judicial system. But he respected Judge's reputation. Everyone in law enforcement did, so he agreed to a meeting. 2 days later, sat in the judge's chambers, Duke lying calmly at his feet. Judge spent 45 minutes explaining Emma's situation in meticulous detail. He described her rescue, her medical condition, her psychological trauma, her complete inability to communicate meaningfully about her experiences. He explained the legal complexity of the case and his concern that Emma's testimony, or lack thereof, would be insufficient to protect her from being returned to her mother's custody if Jessica's rehabilitation progressed as hoped. Then Judge posed his question. Officer, I've heard remarkable things about Duke's work with traumatized children. I'm wondering if there's any possibility that Duke's presence during Emma's testimony might help her access her voice, help her communicate what happened to her. Felt Duke shift slightly beneath the desk, as if the dog could sense the importance of this moment. He chose his words carefully. Your Honor, I need to be completely transparent about what Duke can and cannot do. He cannot make a child speak. He cannot implant memories or create false testimony. What he can do is provide a calming presence that helps traumatized nervous systems regulate themselves. When a child is in a state of extreme fear or trauma, their prefrontal cortex, the thinking brain, essentially shuts down. They can only access their amygdala, the fear response center. Duke can help bring that person back into a state where they can actually think, remember, and communicate. Judge leaned forward intently. And you believe this would be ethical, appropriate for a courtroom setting? Nodded slowly. I believe it would be appropriate, Your Honor, but only under specific conditions. Duke would need to be positioned in a way that's not perceived as influencing the testimony. The child would need to control the interaction, Duke approaching the child, never forcing anything. And most importantly, everyone in the courtroom would need to understand that Duke's presence is purely therapeutic, not evidentiary. His role is to help Emma access her own truth, not to validate or invalidate any particular outcome. The judge sat back in his chair, absorbing this information, could see the wheels turning behind his eyes. The judge was clearly a man of principle, struggling with the idea of introducing something unconventional into a legal proceeding, but could also see the desperation, the desire to find a way to help a child who couldn't help herself. Would Duke's presence in a courtroom stress him? Judge asked. No, Your Honor. Duke is trained for high-stress environments. He maintains his composure in emergency rooms, funeral homes, even active crime scenes. A courtroom, despite its formality, would be relatively calm from Duke's perspective. His only concern would be the child's emotional state, and his instinctive response would be to provide comfort. Judge stood and walked to his window, hands clasped behind his back. I've been trying for weeks to find a legal path through this case that protects Emma without violating Jessica's rights. Every approach I've considered feels inadequate. The problem is that Emma can't tell us what she experienced. Without her testimony, without her voice, the case becomes abstract. It's about legal principles and procedural requirements rather than about this specific child's actual suffering. He turned back to face. What you're describing, having Duke present during testimony, it's unprecedented in this courthouse. It might be challenged. It might be seen as theatrical or manipulative. But what I'm hearing is that it's not unethical. It's not coercive. It's simply providing support to a traumatized person so they can access their own truth. Felt his chest tighten with emotion. Your Honor, I've worked with Duke in situations where children couldn't speak about their abuse. I've watched as his presence somehow gave them permission to break their silence. I can't explain it scientifically. It's almost like Duke helps them understand that they're safe enough to tell the truth, that their truth matters, that they won't be abandoned for speaking it. Judge returned to his desk and folded his hands deliberately. "Officer, I need to be honest with you. This case has been weighing on me heavily. I've struggled with it in ways I haven't struggled with a case in years. 17 custody cases this year, and Emma's situation has affected me more profoundly than all the others combined. I think it's because I can feel the system failing her. I can see the legal machinery grinding forward, but I can't see a clear path to justice. Perhaps what you and Duke offer isn't just a therapeutic intervention. Perhaps it's a gateway to actual truth." Felt Duke rise slightly, as if sensing the significance of the conversation. "Your Honor, if you decide to proceed with this, there are protocols I'd recommend. I'd want to do a preliminary meeting with Emma, just so she and Duke can become acquainted before the courtroom setting. I'd want to coordinate with the court-appointed child psychologist, and I'd want very clear guidelines about what Duke's role will be." "Of course," Judge agreed. "Let's set that in motion immediately. Emma's hearing is scheduled for November 22nd. That gives us 3 weeks to prepare. I want to do this right, officer. I want to give Emma the best possible chance to tell her truth, and I have a feeling that your remarkable dog might be exactly what she needs." As left the judge's chambers with Duke beside him, he felt something shifting in the universe. He didn't know what would happen in that courtroom on November 22nd. He didn't know if Duke's presence would help Emma speak or if it would make no difference whatsoever. But he did know that sometimes the most important work happens not within the rigid confines of law, but in the spaces where compassion and innovation intersect. Judge was offering Emma something unprecedented, a chance to tell her truth in a way her traumatized mind could access. And Duke, with his limitless capacity for unconditional presence, would be there to help her find her voice. The morning of November 22nd arrived with crystalline autumn light streaming through the windows of his house. She had been awake since 4 a.m., unable to sleep despite taking a mild sedative the night before. Today was the day everything would be decided. Today, Emma's entire future would be determined by a judge, attorneys, and a legal system that sometimes felt more Byzantine than just. Had dressed carefully in a navy blazer and pearl earrings, not to impress anyone, but because she needed to feel like a warrior going into battle, and the right clothes provided psychological armor. Emma had woken at 6 a.m. and could immediately tell the child sensed something significant was happening. Children have an uncanny ability to detect parental anxiety regardless of how well adults try to conceal it. Emma had been clingy all morning, refusing to eat the oatmeal had prepared, asking repeatedly, "Grandma, go," had held her close, whispering reassurances that she wasn't going anywhere, that they would always be together. The drive to the courthouse had been torturous. Kept one hand on Emma's small hand in the back seat, maintaining physical contact to reassure both of them. Emma was dressed in a pink dress with white tights, had chosen something soft and comforting rather than formal. The child's eyes were enormous, reflecting confusion and anxiety. At 3 years old, Emma couldn't possibly understand what was about to happen, but her nervous system knew that something momentous was approaching. When they arrived at the courthouse, Helen Martinez's attorney was waiting in the hallway outside the courtroom. She knelt down to Emma's level and spoke in a gentle voice, explaining that today they would go into a special room where Emma could tell people about her home. She didn't explain about Jessica, about custody battles, about the judge's decision. She simply said, "And there's a special friend who's going to be there, a beautiful dog named Duke. Have you ever met a dog, Emma?" Emma shook her head, her thumb going to her mouth. Her anxiety seemed to spike at the mention of something unfamiliar, but also, and this was crucial, there was a flicker of curiosity. Helen had orchestrated this moment carefully, knowing that introducing the concept of Duke before they entered the courtroom might help Emma begin to anticipate something positive. As they approached the courtroom doors, felt her own heart beginning to race. Through the glass windows, she could see the assembled parties. Jessica sitting at one table with her attorney Michael, looking nervous and exhausted. Several court officials. The judge's bench, currently empty. And then, standing against the back wall with Officer, was Duke. Had met with Officer and Duke the previous week during the preliminary session. She had been moved to tears by the dog's gentle demeanor and by his obvious dedication to Emma's. Duke was even more magnificent in person than she had imagined. A stunning German shepherd with a coat like spun gold and eyes that seemed to contain infinite wisdom and compassion. When it brought Duke to meet Emma at the social services office, the child's reaction had been remarkable. Within minutes, Emma's trembling had decreased. Her breathing had slowed. She had touched Duke's fur with tentative fingers, and something inside her had visibly relaxed. But seeing Duke in the formal context of the courtroom was entirely different. The space itself was intimidating. High ceilings, polished wood, the apparatus of authority and power. Everything was oversized and designed to make ordinary people feel small. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead. The temperature felt cold despite the heating system working overtime. As held Emma's hand and walked through the courtroom doors, she felt the child's entire body go rigid. Emma's eyes darted around the room, taking in the unfamiliar faces, the formal furniture, the weight of expectations. Her grip on his hand tightened until her small knuckles turned white. A soft whimper escaped her throat. Judge, who had just taken his seat on the bench, looked directly at Emma and nodded slightly to Officer. This was the choreography they had discussed extensively during the preparation phase. Duke would not be forced upon Emma. The dog would simply be present, available, but never demanding interaction. Officer remained perfectly still, hand on Duke's head, waiting. He had trained Duke for exactly this kind of situation, to be visibly present but not overwhelming, to offer comfort without forcing it, to allow the traumatized child to maintain complete control over the interaction. Emma looked at Duke. Duke looked at Emma. For what felt like an eternity but was probably only 5 seconds, the entire courtroom seemed suspended in stillness. Everyone present, the judge, the attorneys, the court reporters, the social workers, the bailiff, understood that something significant was occurring. This was the moment where a traumatized child would either recoil further into her protective shell or take a tentative step toward trust and healing. Then, very slowly, Emma's trembling began to decrease. Her breathing, which had been rapid and shallow, began to deepen. Her eyes, which had been darting around the room in panic, fixed on Duke's steady gaze, could feel something shifting in her granddaughter's nervous system, a slight relaxation of the tension that had been wound through her small body like a coiled spring. "It's okay, sweetheart," whispered. "Duke is a good friend, he's here to help you." A court-appointed child specialist named Dr. Sarah Williams guided Emma gently toward a specially prepared area of the courtroom. They had arranged a comfortable chair for Emma, positioned at an angle where she could see Duke if she wanted to, but where the dog wouldn't be directly staring at her. A small table held water and tissues. Everything had been designed to make this space feel as welcoming as possible despite the formal courtroom setting. As Emma settled into the chair, Officer guided Duke to a position on the floor, about 8 feet away. Not close enough to overwhelm, but close enough to be reassuring. Duke settled onto his haunches with the calm demeanor of a creature who understood the profound responsibility he carried. Emma's eyes never left Duke's face. Her right hand gripped the armrest of her chair. Her left hand reached out slightly, as if testing whether Duke was real or some figment of her traumatized imagination. Judge looked down at his courtroom and made a mental note. The room felt different now. The formality hadn't disappeared, but something had been introduced, a presence of unconditional acceptance, of being loved without conditions or judgment. Duke represented something that Emma desperately needed to remember, that there existed in this world beings who would be present with her suffering, without requiring anything from her except the truth of her existence. "We're ready to begin," Judge said quietly, nodding to Helen Martinez. As the proceedings commenced, Emma remained transfixed on Duke. And in that transfixion, that complete and utter focus on a being who asked nothing of her except to exist in the moment, something shifted in Emma's traumatized mind. For the first time since her rescue, she felt the possibility of safety. Not because the courtroom had become less formal, not because the stakes had lowered, but because a remarkable dog had walked into her nightmare and reminded her that not all adults would hurt her. That not all love was conditional. That sometimes salvation arrives on four legs and speaks a language deeper than words. Helen Martinez stood before the courtroom, her legal pad in hand, her expression radiating compassion and careful determination. She had prepared for this moment with meticulous attention to every detail. The questions she would ask Emma had been carefully vetted by Dr. Sarah Williams, the court-appointed child psychologist. Each question was designed to be simple enough for a 3-year-old to comprehend, open-ended enough to allow Emma to express her own truth, and gentle enough to not a child already fragile from recent trauma. "Emma," Helen began, her voice soft but clear enough to carry through the quiet courtroom, "can you tell me your name?" For a long moment there was silence. Emma's thumb remained firmly in her mouth. Her eyes remained fixed on Duke, as if the dog were the only stable thing in an unstable universe. Sitting in the gallery behind the railing held her breath. Was this going to work? Would Emma freeze completely, unable to speak at all? Would they have to abandon this entire approach? Then, in a voice so quiet that people had to lean forward to hear, Emma whispered, "Emma." It was barely audible, barely intelligible, but it was a word. It was a beginning. Helen smiled encouragement and continued, "That's wonderful, Emma. Can you tell me where you live? Where is your home?" Emma's eyes flickered away from Duke for just a moment, landing on. In that glance was a question. Is it safe to answer? Is it safe to tell the truth? Nodded slowly, giving her granddaughter permission to speak, giving her the reassurance that truth-telling would be met with love and protection. "Grandma," Emma said, slightly louder this time. "Grandma house." "That's right," Helen affirmed gently. "You live with your grandmother now, but can you tell me about before? Where did you live before you came to Grandma's house?" This was the crucial question, the one that would require Emma to access memories of her trauma. Dr. Williams had warned that this question might trigger an anxiety response. Officer, standing with Duke near the side of the courtroom, tensed slightly, preparing for the possibility that they might need to use Duke's therapeutic techniques. Emma's body went rigid. Her breathing became rapid and shallow. Her eyes darted frantically around the courtroom, and she made a small sound, not quite a word, more like a wounded animal's cry. This was the trauma response manifesting in real time. This was Emma's nervous system recognizing that she was being asked to access memories of danger and pain. Officer made a subtle hand signal. Duke rose smoothly to his feet and without rushing, without being obvious about it, moved 2 steps closer to Emma. Not so close as to overwhelm her, but close enough that his presence became more tangible, more immediately available. It was a masterpiece of therapeutic timing, introducing comfort precisely when the child's nervous system was beginning to. Emma's eyes immediately shifted to Duke. It was as if her traumatized mind was saying, "I need something stable. I need something that won't hurt me. I need proof that safety still exists." Duke remained perfectly still, allowing Emma to absorb his presence, allowing the child's nervous system to begin the process of self-regulation. Helen waited patiently. She had been trained extensively by Dr. Williams in trauma-informed interviewing techniques. She understood that rushing a traumatized child, pressing for answers before they were ready, would only shut down the communication completely. Sometimes the most important work happened in the silence, in the waiting, in the permission given for a child to move at their own pace. After approximately 30 seconds, which felt like an eternity to everyone watching, Emma's breathing began to slow. Her shoulders, which had risen up toward her ears, dropped back down slightly. She reached her small hand out toward Duke, not quite touching, but close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from his body. "It's okay, sweetie," Helen said quietly. "Take your time, you're safe here. Can you tell me about the apartment, where Mommy lived?" Emma's whisper was barely audible, dark, scary, hungry. The courtroom seemed to collectively hold its breath. These were not the fragmented words of a confused child. These were clear, specific descriptors that indicated Emma had accessed genuine memories and was translating them into language. Hands pressed against her mouth to stifle a sob. This was it. This was Emma's voice beginning to emerge from the wreckage of trauma. "That sounds very scary," Helen acknowledged. "Were you alone in the apartment, Emma?" "Yes," Emma said, this time with slightly more volume. "Mommy go away. Mommy go and go and go. No come back." Judge's jaw tightened. Michael, Jessica's attorney, shifted uncomfortably in his seat. Everyone present understood that they were hearing the voice of a child describing abandonment and terror. "How long did Mommy stay away?" Helen asked. Emma's face scrunched up with confusion. At 3 years old, time was not a concept she had developed yet. She couldn't say 8 hours or all night. But she understood the emotional duration. Long, very long, tummy hurt, thirsty. Officer made another subtle gesture and Duke moved fractionally closer to Emma. The dog's head tilted slightly, his ears perking forward, a subtle signal of concern and attention that seemed to communicate, "I see you. I'm here. Your pain matters." "Did anyone come help you?" Helen continued. "Police," Emma said, and she paused, her mind struggling to access the word. "People's in uniform, they help, they nice, but scared, so scared." Emma's left hand finally made contact with Duke's fur. The moment her small fingers touched the dog's coat, something profound happened. Her entire body relaxed slightly, as if she had finally accessed a source of grounding that her traumatized nervous system desperately needed. This wasn't about the dog providing comfort in an abstract sense. This was about a 3-year-old girl's parasympathetic nervous system finally achieving regulation through tactile contact with a being whose presence signaled absolute safety. For the next 45 minutes, Helen gently guided Emma through a recounting of her experience. The questions were carefully constructed to elicit facts without leading her toward particular conclusions. What did the apartment look like? Dirty, things on floor, bad smell. Did Mommy give you food? No, no food, very hungry. What did you do when you were scared? Cry and cry and cry, call for Mommy. Did Mommy come when you called? No, no come. Each question was answered with increasing coherence. Emma's vocabulary seemed to expand as her nervous system became increasingly regulated by Duke's presence and by the experience of telling her truth without being punished for it. She wasn't providing courtroom-ready testimony in the legal sense. Her statements were still fragmentary, still colored by a child's limited understanding of causality and time. But she was providing something far more important, authentic evidence of her own experience, rendered in the raw, unvarnished language of trauma. When Michael attempted to cross-examine, Emma's anxiety began to spike again. The nature of his questions, often phrased in ways designed to introduce doubt or suggest alternative interpretations, triggered Emma's trauma response. But each time, Officer would adjust Duke's position slightly, and the dog would provide exactly the amount of calming presence Emma needed to continue. Judge observed it all with growing clarity. He could see that Emma wasn't being coached or manipulated. He could see that Duke's presence wasn't distorting her testimony, it was enabling it. Without Duke, Emma would have been unable to access her memories at all. With Duke, a traumatized child was finding her voice and telling her truth. By the end of Emma's testimony, even Michael seemed to accept that something remarkable and undeniable was happening. A child who had been silent, frozen in trauma, had found the courage to speak about her own experience. And she had done so not because she was pressured or manipulated, but because she had been given access to something all humans need: the unconditional presence of a being who would witness her pain and accept her truth without judgment. Jessica sat at the defense table, her fingers nervously shredding a tissue into confetti. She had been clean for 94 days. She was counting every single one. 94 days of waking up without the crushing weight of withdrawal, 94 days of rehabilitation sessions and 12-step meetings, 94 days of trying to convince everyone, and most importantly, trying to convince herself that she deserved a second chance at motherhood. But watching her 3-year-old daughter speak about the apartment, about the darkness and hunger and abandonment, was shattering something inside her that all 94 days of recovery had barely begun to heal. Jessica had loved Emma. She loved her still with a fierce, aching intensity that addiction had corrupted but never entirely destroyed. She had never intended to hurt her daughter. She had never woken up that morning thinking, "Today I will abandon my child." But the disease of addiction doesn't work that way. It doesn't announce itself with villainous declarations. It creeps in gradually, transforming a person from the inside out, replacing rationality with compulsion, replacing love with need. She remembered the night before everything had collapsed. She had promised herself she would use just one more time, just to get through the work shift, just to manage the stress of being a single mother, of struggling financially, of feeling completely overwhelmed by the responsibility of raising a human being. She'd done it before. She'd used and still managed to take care of Emma. Surely one more time wouldn't hurt. But that one more time had connected her with other users, had led to a party, had led to hours disappearing into a fog of chemical alteration. She had completely lost track of time. When she'd finally come down, when the drugs had worn off enough for her to access her rational mind, 12 hours had passed. 12 hours during which Emma had been alone in the apartment. Jessica had rushed home in a panic, terrified of what she might find. Emma had been crying, delirious from dehydration, her diaper overflowing, her lips cracked and pale. In that moment, Jessica had felt something break inside her. She had held her daughter and cried, knowing that she had crossed a line she could never quite cross back. Then the police had arrived. Then the social services investigation. Then the removal of her child. And Jessica had finally, truly acknowledged what she had been avoiding for years. She was an addict, and her addiction was destroying her daughter. Now, sitting in the courtroom, listening to Emma describe the terror and abandonment of that night, Jessica felt the weight of her failures pressing down on her like a physical force. She had completed the rehabilitation program. She had been honest in therapy about her root causes, the untreated depression, the unprocessed trauma from her own childhood, the perfectionist expectations she placed on herself that made any small failure feel catastrophic. She had worked the 12 steps. She had made amends to people she'd hurt. She had been given a glimpse of a life where sobriety was possible, where she could be the mother Emma deserved. But 94 days of recovery couldn't undo the night of abandonment. It couldn't erase the fear from Emma's memories. It couldn't rewrite the neurological pathways that Emma's traumatized brain had etched during those 12 hours of terror. Michael, her attorney, leaned over and whispered, "Just listen. Let the testimony continue. We'll have our opportunity to present our case." But Jessica didn't want to just listen. She wanted to scream, wanted to run to Emma and hold her, wanted to explain that she was different now, that the mother who abandoned her wasn't the mother she had become. The problem was, no amount of explanation could matter less to a 3-year-old who had experienced genuine abandonment. When it came time for Jessica to testify, she walked to the witness stand with the weight of her failures dragging at every step. Judge administered the oath. She placed her hand on the Bible and swore to tell the truth. The irony wasn't lost on her. She had always told the truth about loving Emma, but she had lied repeatedly about her capacity to care for her daughter while actively addicted. Michael began his examination gently, walking Jessica through her rehabilitation journey. She spoke about the program she'd completed, the therapy sessions, the support group meetings. She talked about her commitment to sobriety. She acknowledged her addiction as a disease, not a moral failing. She presented evidence of her 94 days clean. Then Helen Martinez began her cross-examination, and it became clear that the gentle questioning of Emma's testimony was not the template for how the prosecution would proceed. "Ms. Helen said, her voice carrying steel beneath its politeness, "You have a 94-day history of sobriety, correct?" "Yes," Jessica answered quietly. "But prior to that night, how long had you maintained continuous sobriety?" Jessica's face paled. 3 months, the 3 months before I relapsed." 3 months, Helen repeated, "and before that?" The pattern emerged gradually but relentlessly. Jessica had attempted sobriety multiple times. Her longest period of sustained recovery prior to this current attempt had been 4 months, 2 years earlier. Before that, weeks. Before that, days. Her history was one of repeated cycles: promise, recovery, relapse, shame, promise again. "Ms., do you believe you will never relapse again?" Helen asked. "I believe I have the tools to maintain my recovery," Jessica answered carefully, with her therapist's language. "That's not what I asked," Helen pressed. "Do you believe you will never relapse again?" I can't promise that," Jessica said honestly. "Addiction is a disease. Recovery is one day at a time. I can't guarantee the future." It was the most honest thing Jessica had said all day, and it was devastating to her case. Because what Judge heard, what the entire courtroom heard, was this: "I cannot guarantee my daughter's safety. I cannot promise that I won't abandon her again. I cannot swear that my recovery will be permanent." Then came the moment that would haunt Jessica forever. Helen gestured, and Emma, who had been quietly sitting with Duke during the adult testimony, suddenly became aware that her mother was speaking. She looked up, her eyes suddenly wide, and looked directly at Jessica for the first time since entering the courtroom. Officer made a subtle movement, and Duke responded by moving slightly closer to Emma, his massive body becoming a physical barrier between the child and her mother. It wasn't aggressive or obvious, but it was unmistakable. Duke's body language communicated, "This child is under my protection." Emma's face crumpled. She began to cry, not the tentative whimper she'd made earlier, but genuine tears streaming down her small face. She buried her head in Duke's fur, her entire body shaking with the weight of conflicting emotions. This was her mother. This was the woman who had given her life, who had sang her lullabies, who had once been her entire world. But this was also the woman who had left her alone in the dark. Jessica's face shattered. She opened her mouth as if to speak, as if to offer some explanation or apology, but no words came. What words could possibly bridge the gulf between a 90-day recovery program and a child's traumatized nervous system? What justification could matter when confronted with the reality of her own daughter's terror? Judge called for a brief recess. As officers moved to escort Emma out of the courtroom, the child's eyes never left Duke. She held onto the dog's collar, her small hand gripping the leather like a lifeline, like the only thing keeping her anchored to safety. Jessica watched her daughter leave the courtroom. She watched as Duke, a creature who had never met Emma before this day, had become more of a mother to her than Jessica herself could be. And in that watching, Jessica finally understood the true cost of her addiction. It wasn't measured in 90 days or rehabilitation programs or support group meetings. It was measured in her daughter's fear, in her own daughter's instinctive recoil from her presence, in the reality that she had damaged something in Emma that no amount of recovery could undo. Michael put a hand on her shoulder. "You did well," he whispered. But they both knew it didn't matter. Nothing Jessica had said or done in that courtroom could compete with a 3-year-old's genuine terror at the sight of her mother's face. The afternoon sun was casting long shadows through the courtroom windows when Judge called for a final recess before the closing arguments. It had been a brutal day of testimony. Emma's fragmented but devastating account of abandonment and terror, Jessica's honest admissions about the fragility of her recovery, expert testimony from child psychologists about trauma and attachment, medical evidence of Emma's physical neglect. The courtroom had been an emotional gauntlet for everyone present. Sat in the gallery, her hands clenched so tightly that her fingernails were drawing blood from her palms. Helen Martinez sat beside her, making final notes on her legal pad, preparing for the closing argument that would essentially determine Emma's future. The evidence seemed compelling, but the law was not always just. The judge's ruling could still surprise everyone. Officer stood with Duke near the courtroom's rear entrance. The dog's breathing had become deeper, his energy lower. He had been working therapeutically for nearly 8 hours, and while Duke was trained for extended deployments, could see the strain in the dog's muscles, the slight droop of his ears. Duke had given everything he had for Emma today. When the recess ended, Judge made an unusual announcement. Rather than proceeding directly to closing arguments, he wanted to ask Emma one final question, not as testimony, but as a matter that might help clarify the situation for everyone involved. Helen and Michael looked at each other uncertainly. This was unprecedented. Judge had never deviated from standard procedure in this way before. "I'd like to have Emma return to the courtroom," Judge said quietly. "I have a single question, nothing more. Just one question that I believe might be important for all of us to hear." Officer brought Emma back into the courtroom. The child was visibly exhausted, her small frame drooping with the weight of everything she'd experienced that day. But when she saw Judge, when she realized she was being given another chance to speak, something shifted in her expression. It was as if Emma understood on some level beyond her 3 years of comprehension that her words mattered, that she had power in this room, that her truth could shape her own destiny. Emma was not placed in the witness stand this time. Instead, Judge called her to approach the bench. Officer walked beside her, with Duke maintaining his constant, reassuring presence. Emma's small hand gripped the dog's collar as they walked toward the judge. Judge Richard, a man who had presided over thousands of cases in his 32 years on the bench, a man who had trained himself to maintain judicial composure in the face of all human drama, looked down at this 3-year-old girl with an expression that transcended law and procedure. What he saw was not a witness. He saw a person. He saw a human being who had experienced genuine abandonment and terror, who had survived through nothing but her own resilience, and who now faced a decision that would determine everything about her future. "Emma," Judge said, his voice soft but carrying enough weight to silence every person in the courtroom, "I'm going to ask you one question. It's the most important question I've asked all day. And I want you to answer with your heart, not because anyone is telling you what to say. Do you understand?" Emma nodded slowly, her thumb creeping toward her mouth, the gesture of a frightened child seeking comfort. "Emma," Judge continued, "there are 2 places you could live. You could live with your grandmother, or you could live with your mommy, Jessica. I want to know, Emma, who do you want to live with? Who makes you feel safe?" The entire courtroom seemed to stop breathing. This was the moment. This was the question that rendered all the testimony, all the legal arguments, all the procedural requirements almost secondary to the basic, fundamental truth, a child's instinctive knowledge about where she felt safe. Emma was quiet for a long moment. Her eyes moved around the courtroom, landing briefly on Jessica, who sat at the defense table with tears streaming down her face. Jessica's mouth opened and closed, as if she wanted to say something but couldn't find the words. Michael placed a hand on her shoulder, a gesture both comforting and restraining. Then Emma's eyes moved to who sat in the gallery with her own tears flowing freely. Mouthed the words, "It's okay, baby. Tell the truth." Emma looked back at Duke, as if drawing strength from the dog's steady presence, as if accessing the courage that Duke had helped her find throughout this long day. The dog's eyes locked with hers, and in that moment an entire conversation seemed to occur, a communication beyond language, a validation of Emma's truth before she even spoke it. Emma stood up slightly taller. She took a deep breath that seemed to come from somewhere deep within her small chest. And then, in a voice that was not as quiet as her earlier testimony, in a voice that carried the weight of genuine conviction and the clarity of a traumatized child who had finally found the words to name what she knew to be true. Emma said, "Grandma safe." The two words hung in the courtroom air like a bell that had been struck and continued to resonate. No one moved. No one spoke. Several people were openly weeping. Hands covered her face as sobs shook her entire body. Officer's eyes closed briefly, and when he opened them again, moisture lined his lower lashes. Then Emma, with a sudden surge of courage that seemed to come from her newfound voice, turned to Officer and, looking directly at Duke, added with absolute clarity, "Duke safe." 4 words total. 4 simple words rendered in the broken, imperfect diction of a traumatized 3-year-old. And yet those words contained more truth, more evidence, more compelling testimony than all the expert witnesses and legal arguments combined. Judge removed his glasses and pressed his fingers to his eyes. When he looked up again, his expression had shifted. The internal struggle that had defined his relationship with this case seemed to have crystallized into clarity. He nodded slowly, as if to himself, as if confirming something he had come to understand. "Thank you, Emma," Judge said softly. "You've been very brave today, very, very brave." He gestured to Officer, who gently led Emma back toward the rear of the courtroom. But as Emma turned to leave, she reached down and gripped Duke's collar one final time, her small face pressed against the dog's neck, absorbing comfort and giving gratitude simultaneously. Jessica watched her daughter leave the courtroom once more. She watched as the child who bore her face, who carried her DNA, who she would always love, chose safety over biology, chose the grandmother who had fought for her over the mother who had failed her. And in that watching, Jessica finally truly understood addiction's ultimate cost. Not measured in years of recovery or rehabilitation programs or support group meetings, but measured in the loss of her daughter's trust, in the distance between them that her own disease had created, in the reality that even if she maintained sobriety for the rest of her life, she would spend that life rebuilding what she had destroyed. Judge placed his glasses back on his face. He straightened some papers on his desk, and when he looked out at the assembled courtroom, everyone present knew that a decision had been made. 2 simple words, "Grandma safe," had done what all the legal arguments, all the testimony, all the procedures could not do. They had revealed the truth of a child's own experience, stated with the undeniable clarity that only a traumatized person can muster when they finally feel safe enough to speak. 3 weeks after Emma's testimony, on a crisp December morning that felt somehow different from all the days that had preceded it, Judge Richard sat in his chambers with the custody case file spread before him, one final time. He had spent those 3 weeks drafting his ruling with meticulous care, ensuring that every legal principle was honored, every procedural requirement was met, and every word reflected the careful balance between law and justice that he had spent 32 years learning to navigate. The ruling was comprehensive. It addressed Emma's medical evidence of neglect. It incorporated the psychological evaluations of both and Jessica. It included detailed analysis of Emma's testimony, not as the sole determinant of custody, because children's statements alone could not be the foundation of custody decisions, but as compelling evidence of a child's own experience and her stated preference. Most importantly, the ruling acknowledged that while Jessica's recovery efforts were genuine and worthy of respect, the priority of the court must always be the child's safety, and not the parent's rehabilitative possibilities. The decision was for permanent, full custody to be awarded too, with all rights and responsibilities that accompanied permanent guardianship. Jessica would be permitted supervised visitation rights, contingent upon her successful completion of the court-mandated rehabilitation program and demonstration of sustained sobriety through regular drug testing. Even then, any visitation could be terminated if Emma showed signs of distress or if Jessica failed to maintain her recovery commitments. Judge read through the ruling one final time, making minor edits, ensuring that the language was both legally sound and accessible to the ordinary people whose lives it would forever alter. When he was satisfied, he signed his name with deliberate formality and placed the document in the official court file. The case was decided. Emma's future was secured. The legal machinery of justice had, against considerable odds, produced an outcome that prioritized the most vulnerable person in the situation. But Judge also included something unusual in his ruling, a detailed discussion of the therapeutic dog intervention and its role in helping Emma access her own testimony. He wrote extensively about trauma-informed approaches to child custody cases, recommending that other judges consider similar approaches when children were too traumatized to communicate their own experiences through traditional legal questioning. He praised Officer and K-9 Officer Duke specifically, noting that their work represented a model for how law enforcement and therapeutic intervention could work together to serve justice. The ruling would make local news. It would be discussed in judicial circles across Tennessee and beyond. It would eventually influence changes in how child testimony was conducted in family law cases throughout the state. But none of that mattered to Judge in this moment. What mattered was that a 3-year-old girl would wake up in her grandmother's home, safe, and protected by the force of law as well as the force of love. The following morning received official notification of the ruling. She held the document in her trembling hands, reading the words multiple times, needing to verify that this was truly happening, that the nightmare had finally ended. Emma was legally hers. Not temporarily, not provisionally, but permanently. Their family was whole. When told Emma the news, the child didn't fully understand its legal significance. But she understood the emotional tone of it, understood that her grandmother was crying happy tears, understood that something fundamental had shifted in her world. She climbed into his lap and simply held her, two people who had endured trauma together finally finding solid ground. Officer received a call from Judge's chambers requesting his presence for a special acknowledgement. When he arrived at the courthouse with Duke on a Saturday morning, when the building was quiet and empty of the usual courtroom drama, he found Judge waiting in his chambers with something remarkable. "Officer," Judge said formally, "I wanted to give you this personally." He held out a framed document, a certificate of commendation from the Tennessee judicial system, recognizing Officer and K-9 Officer Duke for their extraordinary service in facilitating justice for a traumatized child and pioneering trauma-informed approaches to family law proceedings. Officer accepted the framing with genuine humility. He looked at Duke, whose tail was wagging slightly, as if the dog understood that he was being honored. "Your Honor, Duke and I are just grateful we could help. This whole situation, it's reminded me why this work matters so much." Judge smiled, and for a moment, the weight that had defined his expression throughout the case seemed to lift. "You've done more than help, Officer. You've fundamentally changed how I understand justice. You've shown me that sometimes the most important legal work happens outside the traditional boundaries of law. Thank you, both of you." 2 days before Christmas, Officer surprised Emma and with a visit. He brought with him something he'd specially commissioned, a framed photograph of Emma and Duke together, captured during one of their preliminary therapy sessions. In the photo, Emma was smiling genuinely for the first time since her rescue, her small hand resting on Duke's head, her face displaying a peace and security that hadn't been present in any earlier photographs. Emma's eyes lit up when she saw the picture. "Duke," she exclaimed, pointing at the image. She looked up at Officer. "Duke's safe." "Duke is very safe," Officer confirmed. "And so are you, Emma. You're safe now." Over the following months, Officer and Duke made periodic visits to his home. These weren't formal therapeutic sessions anymore, but rather celebrations of healing. Emma's recovery was gradual but steady. The nightmares decreased in frequency. She began to speak in fuller sentences. She started preschool, and while she had some behavioral challenges related to her early trauma, she was able to engage with other children and build new relationships. had enrolled her in therapy with a trauma-specialized child psychologist, and the combination of professional support, stable home environment, and ongoing connection with Duke created a foundation for genuine healing. Also attended a support group for grandparents raising traumatized. She connected with other people who understood the particular challenges of rehabilitating a child who had been damaged by parental neglect and addiction. These connections became lifelines, reminding her that she wasn't alone, that the struggle she was experiencing was shared by others, that healing was possible even when it seemed impossibly slow. Jessica remained in residential treatment for 6 months. She completed the program and found a job in retail management. She attended her support group meetings consistently, and for the first time in her adult life, she maintained continuous sobriety for longer than 4 months. After 6 months of clean drug tests and demonstrated commitment to her recovery, she was permitted supervised visitation with Emma. The first supervised visit was conducted by a professional social worker trained in facilitating contact between children and parents they had experienced trauma from. Emma was anxious but not terrified. She had had months of therapy and healing. She understood, in the way that children understand such things, that her mother was a person struggling with disease, that she could love her mother without trusting her mother with her safety. Jessica cried during that first visit, but they were tears of both grief and gratitude. Grief for what her addiction had taken from her daughter, but gratitude that Emma had been given the chance to heal, that her daughter was safe and loved, that she herself had the opportunity to rebuild some kind of relationship, even if it would never be the relationship that biological mother and daughter were meant to have. Judge received occasional updates about Emma's progress. He heard from officer from the social services department. He read about how his decision had influenced other judges in the state to adopt trauma-informed approaches to child testimony. He learned that his ruling in the case had actually contributed to changes in Tennessee family law that prioritized children's voices and in custody proceedings. But perhaps most significantly, Judge learned to trust something he hadn't fully trusted before: the possibility that justice and compassion could sometimes be the same thing, that protecting the most vulnerable didn't require abandoning legal principle, that sometimes the most sophisticated legal work involved creating space for a traumatized child to speak her own truth. Emma grew. She would carry the trauma of her early abandonment forever. That wasn't something that time or therapy could erase entirely. But she also grew into a child who knew she was loved, who understood that safety was possible, who had learned through the presence of a remarkable dog that there existed in this world beings who would bear witness to her pain without judgment. And whenever she felt scared, whenever the shadows of her early trauma threatened to overwhelm her, Emma would grip her hand tightly and whisper the same 2 words that had changed everything: "Grandma safe." And who had fought so fiercely to make those words true would hold her granddaughter close and whisper back, "Always, baby, always."